You're listening to Swinburne's AI in Education podcast. This podcast is being recorded on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands in Hawthorn and Melbourne's east and outer east, where Swinburne's campuses are located. We acknowledge the First Peoples are the first teachers, pedagogically caring for country, kin and ancestors. My name is Rowena Ulbrick and I'm Academic Director Digital Literacies at Swinburne University. I'm spearheading Swinburne's AI community of practice. We've had over 350 educators involved this year, featuring leading academics from Swinburne, as well as academic researchers both nationally and internationally, helping us to grapple with the use of Gen AI in higher education. I've welcomed back three of Swinburne's leading academic researchers on the impact of AI in higher education to share with me their reflections on how the use of AI has changed this year, if at all, what we've learned and where we may be headed in 2025. You'll hear from Professor Ruth Bridgstock, Director of Employability, Dr. Katya Pechenkina and Dr. Jeremy Nguyen, both academic researchers on AI in higher education at Swinburne. I hope you enjoy my conversation with these pioneers as we reflect on the impact that AI has had on learning and teaching across the year. I'd like to start by thanking each of you for joining us today, sharing your perspectives on what's changed and what's been a bit slower to change potentially, and where we might be headed next year with AI. Let's kick things off with you introducing yourselves. Ruth, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Rowena, for inviting me to be part of this podcast. I am Professor and Director of Employability here at Swinburne, and I'm really interested in how Gen AI is impacting and will impact the capabilities that students need in their lives and careers, how work roles are changing, how job application methods are changing because of Gen AI, and the extent to which and ways in which higher education is and should be playing a role in developing the capabilities that students need.
I can go next. So my name is Katya Pechenkina. I'm a senior lecturer in learning and teaching in EIX, Education Innovation Exchange at Swinburne. I'm also very excited to be here in this room recording this. So my background is in research in higher education. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. That's what my PhD was in. And I was researching in higher education on different topics for over a decade now, starting with looking at factors of Indigenous academic success, and now looking at how we, staff and students, are affected by education technologies, by change in higher education. So I'm interested in the human angle. I'm interested in how we feel about things and what to make of it. And my entry into Gen AI research happened last year when I was invited to contribute to a book on higher education for good. So we were supposed to pick a topic of great importance at the time and of all the time, I suppose, in higher education, and kind of research it, think about it, and the angle had to be, how can we speak about this positively? How can we use it in a positive way with our academics and students? And I picked Gen AI as a way of upskilling myself and educating myself on the topic. So I wrote a book about governance of Gen AI because I think that's relevant to my interests and how we govern this new technology that's affecting so many aspects of our teaching and learning practices, of how we administer education, how we deal with it with students, how we support students. So that's my contribution, and I'm researching currently into that.
I'm Jeremy Nguyen. My research is in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and applications towards business, writing, and education. I work as a contractor for some of the top AI labs in the world. If you've heard that news story that, went everywhere, hey, why does ChatGPT talk like that? What's that word that it uses all the time? You know what word I'm talking about, right? Delve. That was from my research. The Delve story was some work that I did. I'm working I'm contributing to a textbook for O'Reilly on large language models. But the reason I'm here, I suppose, is I'd love to hear more about how large language models and AI, what it can do for us students and for what's possible. I've waited all my life for this. I'd never thought we would cross this threshold in my lifetime. I honestly thought it was science fiction, and the amount that we saw the problems with students who weren't able to do this, and who we as academics only had so much time where we could consult with them one-on-one. And now just to have this dropped into our lap, it's just an incredible time to be alive. And I'd love to hear how other people are making the most of this.
Thank you so much. And I know we've got the right people in the room here, and really looking forward to digging into some of that work that you just shared now. And Ruth, I'm going to start with you. And when you presented to our community practice almost, 12 months ago, it was really interesting because you were sharing your research in how AI was impacting the student perceptions of their studies, of their career, a whole range of things. And you mentioned that students were freaking out a little bit. And it was something that I kept coming back to throughout the year, and it kept me honest a little bit in our work of saying, well, does this contribute to reducing that anxiety? So I'm interested, do you think they're still freaking out?
Yeah, well, my presentation earlier in the year did paint a picture of uncertainty for both students and educators around generative AI. So I did some survey research in the first quarter of 2024, so well and truly out of date now, that showed many students weren't too sure about AI and its affordances and whether or not they should be using it, and if so, how. Many were still using it because they didn't want to be sort of left behind, but they were not too sure that they were using it well or appropriately, or if they were going to get into trouble. Equity group students had a tendency to feel extra worried about it and what the implications might be for their futures and their practice. Likewise, my research showed that educators were following a fairly typical technology acceptance model curve. So we had a few early adopters who were sort of really leading the charge with their curriculum and pedagogy, but the majority were kind of hanging back and sort of waiting to know a little bit more about, what was allowed, what could they do, what were the implications for things like academic integrity. And institutional policies at that stage were in a bit of a disarray as well. Should we allow our students to be using generative AI tools? And I really think that we've matured on that front over the last year. So, and since then, there's also been much better national level research on student attitudes and adoption, and also where educators are at. So I'd point anybody interested to the AIinHE.org research conducted by 4 Australian universities, led by Kelly Matthews up at UQ, around the latest in students' perspectives on adoption of AI, their ideas around its affordances and so on. It's just released a couple of weeks ago, and so it's likely to be a little more up to date. Similarly, I think QUT has led a research project on staff use and perspectives of generative AI. But I think if I had to summarise how we've shifted over the last year since my research came out, I'd say we probably know a little more, all of us, including students. We've had a chance to try out generative AI. Some of our policies and our guidelines have been updated institutionally, so we know better what some of the possibilities are. And there's also been guidance come out from TEXA, higher education standards and so on, so we know more about what is safe, what is good quality, and so on. So we've started to build AI into our educational practices as well to a greater extent, foster those AI literacies for students and educators. But I would say there's still some uncertainty. We still have educators freaking out to some extent. We do have some educators on the ground saying, oh my gosh, no, we can't have this in my unit. What am I going to do? How are we going to evidence that students are actually learning something? And equally, we have students, particularly from those equity groups, who are saying, do I have access to the paid accounts? And if I don't, am I going to be disadvantaged? What can I do? These sorts of things. We still don't know exactly where AI is heading. And I think my most recent research, which is about AI use in industry, really reinforces that also. But more on that in a minute.
And I'm looking forward to hearing that, because one of the things that also stayed with me when you shared your first research was around students' perceptions of how generative AI will maybe shift their career direction and, their choices and whether or not they've made the right choice. So looking forward to hearing more about that. Jeremy, I'm going to come to you now. And it was really interesting for me. It was some of the first peer-reviewed research that I understood around the impact of generative AI on student learning, and your work around and your findings of your research, finding that when students had access to ChatGPT, that they actually had greater inaccuracies in their work, but they had more confidence in their answers, confirming something, our worst fears that we had suspicions of around the role of generative AI in learning and teaching. This was probably now over 12 months ago, so I'm really interested in how your work with generative AI has evolved since then, with students in particular.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rowena. That was, over 12 months ago, and over 12 months in what's been happening with large language models and AI lately. It's the equivalent of a lifetime ago. It's like talking about black and white TV or papyrus scrolls. So I'm very glad we did that research. It actually showed that students did better, because multiple things can be true at one time. Students did better when they got assistance, and they also had more misinformation in their answer. It's possible for both of those things to be true. But that was so long ago. I think in the last 12 months, one thing that really shook me, I guess it really forced me to update my mental models, was this thing that we've heard of called humanity's last exam. The idea that it's like, hey, if you've got a question that AI cannot answer correctly, that you can answer correctly, you can take it from your PhD, it can be the toughest thing that you know. If you can name one question that AI cannot answer correctly, then you either get $5,000 or $500 and co-authorship on the humanities last exam paper. To me, that's a big thing, because we're all like, oh, come on. Like, AI's cool, but it's so wrong so often. But when controlled trials are done and money is on the line, it was remarkably difficult for, fewer than, when I was first trying it, fewer than 500 people on Earth were able to find a question that was able to beat all of the models, including the O1 preview model at the time. It was remarkably difficult. It still is. I've been able to get, I believe, 4 questions through so far, but that's 4 from my entire career and lifetime. It is remarkably difficult. And so how does this affect the way we are going to teach our students or give our students exposure to AI? It's a completely different thing. But before, when we're like, hey, here's this thing that hallucinates all of the time. And now we're like, here's this thing. It still hallucinates all of the time, but it can solve problems that our PhD students are not able to do over 3 months. It can solve it in 9 seconds. So there's a different trade-off that we're working with here, I suppose. And in just the most applied way, like in terms of how does this affect my actual students every week. I told you this story earlier on, Rowena. Actually, am I rambling a bit? Shall I? I'd love to hear from Katerina, from Katya, sorry.
You might want to jump in, Katya. I mean, yeah, and feel free to sort of, contribute to what Jeremy's saying too. But, around your work and your book chapter and your expertise in AI governance and developing those guardrails. And I know you had a heavy hand in, authoring the assessment guidelines for educators. So, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was listening to Ruth and I was agreeing with everything you were saying. I was listening to Jeremy and I was kind of also being convinced by the greatness of Gen AI. So I'm a technology realist, I guess. I'm very calm and I try to keep grounded approach to things. I feel like education, the state of freaking out about things, that's very normal, right? For education, for higher ed. Academics are always freaking out about something. And students are as well. I would imagine, and we know that students are freaking out about Gen AI still, right? And we just came out of 3 days of Escalate conference last week. Every second paper was about Gen AI, something about Gen AI. Everybody's talking about it. We're hearing that students very concerned about how Gen AI is lowering the quality of their higher education. They're very concerned about that. They're concerned that other students are using it and therefore disadvantaging them somehow if they're not using it, something that you've discussed with as well. But I feel like, having been at Swinburne now for over a decade, we've gone through so many cycles of this. And I don't want to compare Gen AI. It is unique in some ways, but it is also very, very typical, in how it's affecting us right now. We went through changes of learning management systems. We went through, lecture recordings, when we went from opt-in to opt-out, the big policy changes and people were reacting in a very, very, typical way. You have a group of pioneers and champions who will take up the new technology and pioneer it and write research about it and very excited and enthusiastic. Then you have the resistors who will be very vocal about it, saying, no, absolutely not. We'll never do this. And then they kind of soften their approach. And then it kind of just settles into kind of like, we have accepted it. Lecture recordings are here to stay. Gen AI is here to stay. Blended learning is here to stay. I've been here long enough to hear blended learning will never work for insert discipline, in engineering. This will never work in IT. This will never. Well, guess what? We have moved on. So it's okay. So my approach when I was, and I wrote other articles about Gen AI. I worked with my colleagues from marketing. We looked into Gen AI as a phenomenon, full of kind of binaries and these dichotomies, I should say. Gen AI is a friend, but it's a foe. It's popular, but it's also banned. It becomes more popular when it's banned. There's all these things that we kind of deal with in the discourse around Gen AI, same in higher education. And when I was looking into, how can we govern these things? Because we have to come up with something, some approach, and some universities just banned it altogether. Some universities says, do whatever you want. It's wild, wild west out there. Just experiment and learn and apply. We in Swinburne, we took a cautious approach. We thought a little bit about it, it aligns well with my approach to things. And we came up with our guidance, which was basically an attempt to push forward the pedagogical rationale for using Gen AI in teaching and learning, in assessment, and however you're using it, why are you doing it? How is it aligned with your unit's learning intended outcomes, with the overall degrees outcomes, what graduate attributes that you're teaching your students to achieve, and then at the same time, how can we make sure we preserve agency, right? So we want to look at data, digital data, equity principles, how can we make sure that students are educated about Gen AI and the issues around, many issues around it, the data justice approach, what's happening to our data, what is Gen AI doing, how is it generating responses, can we rely on these responses? So when we were designing the guidance document, we basically wanted to emphasize the principles, the data justice principles about, responsibility, transparency, agency, giving students an option to opt out from using it if it's possible to give that option. And we gave, examples of the language that our educators can use around how they how they write Gen AI use into their units. So, for example, there's no Gen AI is allowed in this unit, and that's okay if that's what academic decides for themselves, or some is allowed, and here are the types of use that are allowed. So we know that from my research that students are primarily using Gen AI for brainstorming, structuring, some editing. That's what they say, that they're not actually producing big chunks of assessment using Gen AI. Some do, but not the majority using it this way. In my own unit, I convene units in grad cert, in grad cert in teaching and learning. I allow some users as long as they declare it and show me the outputs, and I want to compare then what they have generated with Gen AI and what they ended up writing. So yeah, that's fine. Use it. Don't abuse it. And if you do abuse it, we have academic integrity rules in place. We have a very, very good and robust process at Swinburne that we can take students through. I have experienced recently in my own cohorts, and it works. So yeah, I guess that's my approach. The question was about guardrails. Guardrails is the language applied to high risk settings, right? So Gen AI in higher education, I don't see this particularly, it's not life or death decisions that are being made here with machines usually, right? When you talk about guardrails, it's about, if Gen AI is making decisions about whether to grant somebody medical treatment or, that's a different, or employment or discrimination when we employ people. Human resources use AI extensively when sorting out candidates who apply for jobs, right? And we know that there's hidden bias, there's gendered bias, there's racial bias. Gen AI has an immense capacity to discriminate because we train it on the data that has those flaws, right? And it's our job as educators to educate our students about this and engage in meaningful conversations with them. So I wouldn't say guardrails. We call it guidance here. Yeah, the principles, the kind of what we think is the best practice approach. And so we do that and try to have our academics maintain their agency in their decision making about these things. So here's my long-winded answer to this.
No,
Thank you.
Perfect and a great. I think taking us through even that example of how it's been normalised to a certain extent has shown in 12 months the shift that has happened. And so really interesting to see. And thank you for sharing that. The terminology matters and how we talk about it.
Yes.
And I think, it can be anxiety provoking, and I thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure I'll be careful to use the guardrails again. I'm seeing that word a lot, but I think you're right. So really interesting. Thank you. We're going to have a look to the future now, and without getting the crystal ball out, I'm really interested in actually just how your research interests are evolving, the work that you're currently doing in this space, and what we might see from some of the research that you're leading coming next year and beyond. Ruth?
Thanks, Rowena. Picking up on some of the themes in the previous answer, actually, I've become very interested in industry AI use and adoption. So my day job is Director of Employability here at Swinburne. So I'm responsible for work-integrated learning, placements, internships, broadly sort of fostering the capabilities that students are going to need to be industry and professionally ready. And we've also got a team that's responsible for graduate employment and making sure that students have the opportunity to apply for and access jobs. So I'm leading a project right now about how our industry partners, so that is our industry and professional partners who are offering work-integrated learning placements, internships and graduate roles, are adopting AI to help them in different sorts of ways. So I'm particularly interested in disciplines in business, so service industries, IT. I'm interested in law, how their recruitment practices are changing, and then how those entry-level roles that we might be offering our WIL students that traditionally would be offered to entry-level or graduate students, and how those roles and those processes are changing quite pragmatically. So the literature and what's coming out from my research is suggesting that how students and graduates are applying for jobs right now, as well as into the future, is changing very significantly, and that careers education, career development, learning, and the support for students to avail themselves of those opportunities to apply for those roles is not really keeping up at this point. So that's the first thing. Brief anecdote. Enrolled student comes in and says, I've just applied for a role in Bunnings and I had to speak with Siri. And try to convince her that I was the right person for this job. It really threw me. It's happening right now. Screening, particularly, but also things like keyword selection, looking at CVs, at LinkedIn profiles, and then also decision support for the humans involved in that recruitment process. And that's where we start to be a little concerned about things like bias. And we're seeing that come out as well. Not so hidden bias, actually, in terms of things like, are our international students accessing the same sorts of opportunities as our domestic students and graduates? Actually, the evidence is suggesting that no, they're not. And partly this is an algorithmic thing. So we're working quite actively with our industry partners to be able to build their AI literacies and to make sure that they are combating that sort of bias. Because our industry partners are also telling us that no, they don't want that kind of bias. They genuinely want the best student, the best candidate for that role. And they don't want the same sort of the same sorts of candidates that Gen AI might be suggesting to them. So there's something deeply in there about, employers recognizing that diversity is really important in the workplace. It's really important in terms of fostering innovation, in terms of engaging with audiences and with markets, and it's not going to help them if they buy into Gen AI just holeless bolus without thinking about it. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is what are those students and what are those graduates being asked to do in those roles? So we know, for instance, that law is one of the most exposed occupations out there. I mean, traditionally speaking, your baptism as an articled clerk in a law firm is to summarise the case law and the legislation associated with things and write some letters for some clients. It's really valuable work. It's legitimate, and it's something that gives students the introduction to the industry and to the profession. But now you can hit a button and AI will be able to do at least the first pass of that in a few seconds. So then what is the role of that entry-level student, that articled clerk? What can we meaningfully be asking them to do in employment situations, either as graduates or as well students, that's going to add value to industry and is also going to give them that learning that they need? And that question, it's very much in flux right now because industry are still very uncertain about the extent to which and ways in which they should be using generative AI, and some are leaping ahead and using it, and then they want students to come in and be ready and literate and able to use the Gen AI tools, and then add value in human sorts of ways in addition to that. So then there's questions about what are we doing in higher education to develop those capabilities so that the students are ready to hit the ground running, use the AI and value add on top of that. And that's where I'm going to leave that answer.
Well, and so important, Ruth. And I know that certainly talking to some industry partners, they're saying, well, we're looking to universities to sort of also guide us.
Yeah.
And we're looking to industry because we want to make sure that we're creating the experiences that students can actually develop AI literacy within that discipline context. Law's a really good example that you shared, and we've been working on a project with a group of law academics looking at how they can respond to some of these challenges. And they're doing that very thing. What sort of software should they be using? What should we be embedding in? So it really speaks to me that your research is so important, because it's about actually developing that knowledge alongside one another and developing those partnerships, because it certainly works both ways. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that next year. You've certainly piqued lots of interest, and look forward to bringing you back to talk in more detail about that.
No worries, Rowena.
I'm already roping you into the next one. Jeremy, I'd love to hear more from you about how you see your research evolving in next year and beyond.
Oh, thanks, Rowena. I just thought that some of the things that Ruth was saying were just so interesting in terms of that pipeline of the mentor to mentee. It's obviously not just in law, but it's been such a way for people to develop skills. And we're just finding so often now that the more senior people find it easier to work with AI as that assistant. And so we're losing that opportunity for the transfer of human capital there. But in terms of what I'm most interested in researching like right now, or some of the things that I'm most interested in researching right now as it relates to teaching and learning, because there's so much. But one is, we know that anecdote of the student who comes to us after exams, like exams have just finished. Very soon I will get a student coming to me and saying, "Oh, I failed. What can I do now?" And in the past, it was always the case that I would say, "I've got a plan for you." And it always works. We've never lost someone who followed this plan. It's come to my consultation every single week. You don't have to have good questions, but you do have to have a question. It can be the stupidest question of all time. But if you come 12 weeks in a row and ask me a stupid question, we've never lost a student coming through. And how many students can we actually do that for if it's a large class? What is exciting to me about an intervention that's happening right now is being able to put together an AI tutor that they can ask questions of all of the time, 24/7, and then come to me still every week, but already having done some of that work, already having a version. So I'm I don't know how we're going to do it as a randomized control trial, because it seems too difficult to have the control group and say, you don't get access to this thing. A personalized tutor, which we know from Bloom's 2 Sigma, is a superior... It takes a C student and makes them an HD student, just the access to one-on-one tuition there. That's one thing I'm very interested in working out how to actually do a randomized control trial while being ethical. Because how do you withhold that from students? But right now, it is going so well in classes. It's having great effects on students. The other thing, which is related to that, is giving students an AI personalized assistant. I think Katya mentioned agency, and I feel if we don't handle it correctly, it's reducing the agency of our students to be like, hey, here's this AI thing, and you just passively accept it like it came from someone else. That's ridiculous. It's like, why didn't you build this AI assistant? And further, instead of listening to some old guy like me tell you about how it's unreliable, why don't you employ your cheekiness as a curious student? Try to break this assistant and show me. Come into class and you put your hand up as a red teamer and say, hey, I broke your assistant 4 times. Here were the things that I did to break it. That's proving to help students see that they're part of this, that the jagged frontier of working out what AI can do and can't do isn't something that is received wisdom. It's constantly changing, and they are active participants in working out what it is, and they are active participants in creating the assistants, the AI assistants that help them. So having them co-create the assistants, it seems to be going really well, giving a higher sense of agency and training the students in a great way. So I'm looking forward to seeing what research shakes out of this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I think what I love about your work is that you are using the AI to really strengthen your connection with students, and you're focusing on that because you know that's what will make a difference. And it's great to see how you can scale up that personalised connection and that tutoring that you offer, that you know will support students to achieve better. So thanks so much for sharing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your research and what shakes out of it next year too. Katya, we'll come to you.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating stuff, Jeremy. And I think what I'm getting from there is that we all as educators just want our students to be curious. We want them to be asking questions. We want them to be engaged and thinking. And a lot of them are engaging with these issues. And this is what I'm saying, in my cohorts. But there's another kind of side to this. And, when I have to mark an assignment that I can see has been written with Gen AI, and blatantly so, and that's submitted at postgraduate level, it's just so demoralizing to have to deal with this. And this is kind of segueing into my research interests, because like I mentioned in my introduction that I'm interested about how humans experience things. I'm interested how humans experience technological change or change in general. How technology makes us think about ourselves as professionals, as academics. What does it do to our academic identity? So these are the things I'm kind of grappling with. So there's two things to the research that I'll be doing next year. One has to do with the guidance around governance, and I'll continue doing that. So we just recently finished surveying our staff and students, so we know how they've been engaging with this document. We know what's working well and what's not working as well. So we're going to be, revising that document, and this is the policy work that I'll continue doing next year, in my capacity as a Swinburne person who is engaged deeply with the issues of governance of Gen AI. But my personal interest, again, comes down to the human connection, human interaction with technology. And some of the things that I've been thinking about is, a lot of my academic peers are very interested in understanding how can they detect, right, Gen AI use. So we know that people really want to be able to detect it. So some people are using like another Gen AI tool to detect Gen AI use in assignments, which is something they're not supposed to be doing. So it's not quite allowed. And people really want to understand what can be done, because they suspect that students use Gen AI to cheat, probably at higher level than it actually happens. But there is it is a problem of perception, right? So I've read this article some weeks ago about how human participants in the research were asked to determine what was poetry generated by Gen AI versus poetry written by humans, and I was just absolutely blown away that most people thought that Gen AI generated poetry was actually human poetry because it was more straightforward. They could understand it better. They related to it better, and the poetry written by humans was just too convoluted and weird. And as someone who actually, I write creative fiction as well, that was fascinating to hear. So that's something to say about, Gen AI created art and writing. And I'm very interested how sometimes our academics look at something and say, oh, this was written by Gen AI. Absolutely. And the disrespect they feel at that, like, you have wasted my time. How dare you? I have to go for this process with you now. So yeah, I think I'll be kind of designing a study around that, trying to kind of get to the core of this, feelings and perceptions, and see what we can tease out of it in the sense of, helping academics deal with this a bit better.
Fantastic. And I think, you have struck a chord, I think, for many educators who will be listening, who have that reaction. So understanding that further will be really, really important. And I'm certainly fascinated to hear what the outcomes of that research are. Thank you, Katya. Thank you again to our wonderful panel for sharing your perspectives, your expertise, your research. It's been absolutely wonderful hearing from you. So thank you again. Wishing you wonderful holidays, and look forward to connecting in the new year to hear more about the outcomes of your work.